very happy with you. Thank you. Now, I'd like to move on, if I could, to my perennial question about e-cigarettes. And I note since we last discussed and had... I will leave some of the questions for Senator Griff, and I'm sure Senator Leyonhjelm will be back about that as well. But since we last traversed this subject, I noticed that New Zealand has now introduced legislation and some very, I think, very sensible guidelines about this. And so they say scientific evidence on the safety of e-cigarettes is still developing, but there is a consensus now that vaping is much less harmful for smoking. And the New Zealand government is taking a cautious approach by aligning the regulations around vaping with those for cigarettes, which ensures cigarette smokers have access to lower risk alternatives while continuing to discourage people from smoking. They've got very strict guidelines, but they're using this as part of their plan to have the goal to have a smoke-free New Zealand by 2015. Now, as you know, we've 2025. Oh yes, I'm going back to the future. Thank you very much, Secretary. So it just, every time we have estimates, it just seems there's another country now who's doing more work on this and is adopting a similar position. So I'm just wondering if you could advise this committee whether we're getting any closer to looking at this a bit further.
The Secretary can give us an update on WHO because he's just returned very recently from the WHO World Health Assembly. I would draw the Senator's attention to some of the recent Australian statements on it, given that we are in Australia. And so Professor Kelso, the Chief Executive of NHMRC, issued a statement updating an earlier NHMRC statement that said there's currently insufficient evidence to conclude whether
sorry, just with respect to Professor Skerritt, I have seen a lot of the Australian, but that's the point of my question, is that we get Australian experts who reinforce each other that this is a bad thing, we can't look at it, but there's progressive and increasing evidence from overseas, and to me, I know it's good, but it just seems that we're being very close to what's happening overseas.
So I could probably give you some update here.
Yeah.
Look, I've just returned from the World Health Assembly, and at that I meet with some like-minded countries around tobacco control. Of the 7 countries, I think that have this conversation, New Zealand is the only one that has moved in that direction. Most are still in the same place that we are, and that's UK, New Zealand, Canada, and a range of other countries, are still in that space of concern. While there's probably thinking that vaping, as long as it's not using nicotine in a normal form, is better than smoking, there is still a lot of concern around it. Most countries have actually extended their smoking bans to vaping in all public places as well. So there's not a lot of movement internationally. There is some. And I think this is one of those things that's going to bounce around for the next couple of years.
Well, because I've just come back from the UK, and it was very obvious there were a lot of people vaping, but there's also a lot of people in Australia who are now vaping, and given that there's not a position on it, one, we're losing tax revenue, but 2, are they breaking the law, or how are they actually getting it in here and it's being sold freely and people are using it quite openly? Just seems to be there's a bit of a mismatch here.
Yeah, Senator, they're breaking the law if it contains nicotine in most states. In some states, they're breaking the law if the thing resembles a cigarette, even without nicotine. I just want to put on the record what I may have put on the record at earlier estimates, and that is that we would very much welcome an application for 1 or more e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. The same way that we have reviewed and approved applications for chewing gums, for sprays, for lozenges and other products for smoking cessation. There is absolutely nothing stopping a company with a dossier of evidence. So we're going on hearsay, but if a company can submit evidence, they could be the first company in the market with an e-cigarette for smoking cessation. That avenue is open to them.
So nobody's actually put an application in?
We cannot confirm or deny whether companies have put applications in. It's a long-standing, for any prescription medicine, it's a long-standing practice.
while you can't confirm or deny, your previous statement sounded very much to me like you were saying anyone put an application in because we haven't got one yet. So you may or may not have had applications, and if you have, they haven't been approved. They haven't met the standard.
I wouldn't want to speculate down that line, but again, I would very much welcome a decent dossier of evidence and a submission of an e-cigarette product for smoking cessation, accompanied by evidence robust enough evidence for a registered medicine that the product is suitable for use in smoking cessation. Even though you might buy your lozenges and chewing gums in Woolworths and Coles, they've still been through TGA's medicines evaluation process for smoking cessation.